three questions that I think are good to come back to over and over again. I call them here three critical identity questions. Identity. Human societies were much more organized around group identity for most of our evolutionary history, but today we think of ourselves as individuals. No matter what culture we come from, there's some level at which we understand ourselves to be individual, and we ask ourselves, who am I? What makes me who I am? But we also think in societal terms. We have to think about part of how we understand ourselves is not just by looking internally, but we understand ourselves in the nature of our understanding of a relationship to others. Who I am is not only about some existential quality of myself. It's about how I see myself in relationship to all of you, people in my community. So we're always, as we're trying to understand ourselves, we're also asking, what's my relationship to myself, but also what's my relationship to others? And then finally, in what I labeled the ecological level, what is my relationship to the non-human world? We're increasingly aware of this as we recognize the fragile state of that non-human world. We are not just people who look inward or people who look to others. We're also part of a larger living world. And we have some relationship as a species to that world. And what is that? Now notice I say the non-human world. I don't say nature. Sometimes people would ask that question, what is my relationship to nature? And the reason I don't use that term is because we are part of nature. We are not separate from nature. If nature is the living system, the ecosphere, we're as much a part of that as the rabbits and the ants and the broccoli plants. So there's a human community, and then there's a non-human, larger living world that we're part of. What's our relationship to that? And at every one of these levels, you can also ask, what is my obligation? What is my obligation to myself? What is my obligation to others? What is my obligation to that larger living world? So, if you take those three questions and put them into our discussion of capitalism, it seems to me you come to these questions. What is a person under capitalism? How does every economic system has at its core a notion about what it means to be a person? In capitalism, there's a very clear notion of what it means to be a person. In capitalism, in the theory behind capitalism, a person is rational to the degree that one is maximizing self-interest, yes? In capitalism, capitalism is based on the assumption that we are rational maximizers of self-interest. The whole system is based on the notion that you will pursue your own self-interest. And out of those collective pursuits, through the invisible hand of the market, the greatest good will be achieved. Now, we don't have time to argue that one out, but it's important to recognize that capitalism has a theory about what kind of person you are. And it says you are essentially, at your core, a rational maximizer of self-interest. There's a more common phrase for that. May I use it? It's a street phrase. I don't want to offend anybody, but the street version of rational maximizer of self-interest is greedy son of a bitch. That's what it is, right? I mean, in capitalism, the assumption is we're all greed-driven. So there's a theory about personal identity in capitalism. When we think about the collective, our obligations to each other, this is the second question we've already discussed at some length. Can we create real democracy under capitalism? If capitalism defines us as rational maximizers of self-interest and creates a system in which great inequalities in wealth develop, is that going to work in democracy? Interesting question. Okay. And then finally, is sustainability possible under capitalism? Capitalism is an interesting economic system. It's based on an idea of unlimited growth, yes? An economy is doing well when it is growing, yes. In fact, everybody's worried because we don't have enough economic growth. And we know the economy will be healthy again when it is growing. Growing, growing, growing. Okay, so capitalism is a system based on a notion of unlimited growth, but there's one problem with that. It's a finite planet, isn't it? The planet is not growing in an unlimited fashion. It is a finite planet. Now, there's a lot of complex questions here about the degree to which advanced technology can exploit the existing resources, but there is a tension, just like there's a tension at the heart of capitalism about yourself. Right? Capitalism tells you you're greedy, self-interested, and you know you are sometimes, yes? Yes, tell the truth, yes, okay. But you also know that's not all you are. Right? Capitalism, there's a tension with democracy. There's also a tension with this larger living world that we're going to have to come to terms with sooner or later. So that's an attempt to take some of the loose ends from our discussion about capitalism and its relationship to the political system and try and help push us a little more. That's all I was going to say about that. Any questions before, excuse me, before I move on? Okay. So, you're thinking about this question about the relationship of capitalism and democracy, the economic and the political. That's one of the major themes that I tried to highlight as we went forward from the Dahl book to talk about questions in class. Another one, again, I'm trying to look back on the last few weeks and kind of organize, is one of my favorite thoughts, the gap between the rhetoric of the powerful and the reality of the world. One of the things, if we're going to take seriously the question of democracy, one thing we got to do is deal with that economic question. We also have to deal with the fact that there seems to be a pretty consistent and persistent gap between the rhetoric of the powerful and the reality of the world. That if we're going to examine this system in which we live, we're going to have to recognize that. So, we talked briefly in a previous class about what's unfolding in Egypt. Well, let's step back and use the situation in Egypt as an example. The United States claims to be the model for democracy in the world, the first democracy brought into the modern world, and the vehicle by which the rest of the world can democratize. Yes? Kind of a consistent claim of U.S. leaders, that we are, to use that old phrase, that shining city upon the hill. This comes from a 17th century sermon and has been picked up by politicians ever since. That shining city upon the hill, the beacon. The United States is the beacon. That the United States is both a model for democracy. People can look and see how we do it. Right? And it also is an agent to help push forward democracy in the world. All right. Well, what's been going on in Egypt? Again, you've all been paying attention, or you should be paying attention. You know that for now the third week, there are people in the streets of Cairo and other cities in Egypt pressing for the departure of Hosni Mubarak, who is referred to as the President of Egypt, but is in fact a 30-year dictator of Egypt, with no meaningful freedom of expression in that country, no meaningful political association, and no free, fair, open, contested elections. Those three hallmarks of a democratic system have never existed in Egypt. Yet, president after president, starting with Jimmy Carter in the 1970s, let's review them. After Carter, who was U.S. president? Ronald Reagan. Then after Ronald Reagan, we got George H.W. Bush, the father. Then after that, we got Bill Clinton. And after that, we got George W. Bush. And after that, Barack Obama. That's quite a range of presidents, yes? Some Republicans, some Democrats, Northerners, Southerners, very conservative to moderately liberal. That's an interesting range. In the case of Egypt, each one of those U.S. presidents had the same policy, which was to strongly back, with both diplomatic support and military aid, the government first of Anwar Sadat, and then the government of Hosni Mubarak. Is that consistent with U.S. claims about supporting democracy. You can try to make an argument, as some politicians had, that there were overriding considerations, that yes, Hosni Mubarak and before him Sadat were not Democrats. They were not trying to pursue democratic reform in their country, but that we needed stability in the Middle East. Yes? Stability. Yes, we understood that Hosni Mubarak was a thug, that he routinely tortured dissidents in his prisons. We knew that. You know one reason we know that Hosni Mubarak routinely tortures dissidents? Because we send some of our dissidents to be tortured there. Especially after 9/11, Egypt is one of the places when U.S. officials didn't want to do the dirty work themselves. They send them to Egypt or Syria or other places. We outsourced our torture. An interesting idea. The point I'm trying to make is the minute you start getting past the rhetoric of the powerful, you start to see there's a reality on the ground that often doesn't match up. And I use that example precisely because it has persisted across administrations, Republican and Democrat. This isn't a partisan question. I'm not suggesting that Democrats lie and Republicans don't, or vice versa. It's a feature of this system and the power concentrated in this system. And I want us to be thinking about that as well. Every time you open up the paper, that's the first thing you should be asking yourself. It's not just what are the powerful saying today, but what is that gap between the powerful and their words and the ordinary folks on the ground and their reality? And how do they then spin that gap? That's also interesting. Right? And that's where journalism plays a big role. We'll say more about that down the road. All right. Again, I'm trying to move through a lot of things, clean up loose ends, and offer you some sort of frameworks for understanding. All right, so economics and politics, recognizing that the powerful often say one thing and do another. We still